Welcome to another episode of our podcast series for MIT Inspire. I'm Chaswal.
And I'm Ostyn. Our research project discusses the effect of advanced technologies on our nation's workforce and what policies would best prevent high rates of unemployment and financial instability in the future.
Today we are with Jacob Whiten and Sifan Liu from the Brookings Metropolitan Policy Program. They have conducted extensive research on the digitization and automation of the American workforce, as well as the influence of technology on our labor market. Thanks for joining us.
We will be asking them some questions about their research and related topics.
Okay, so I'll go ahead and start. In the paper you two co-wrote, titled Digitalization and the American Workforce, you labeled digitalization as a polarizing agent. Do you view this change as harmful? And if so, how can we rectify this dissolution of the middle class?
Sure. Well, right off the bat, I would say that we don't really view this as harmful. In fact, we think that technological change has always been a driver of productivity growth in the economy, and certainly our findings in the report really validate that as the case this time as well. But certainly it is the case that it has in large degree polarized the labor market between those that have the requisite skills to participate in or I guess to compete for the high digital jobs that pay the best, and those who do not and are increasingly finding it difficult to have access to positions which offer a middle class wage, benefits packages, and really the policy response has to be focused on both promoting digitalization and its growth enhancing effects while mitigating this polarizing tendency.
I think it's right again, like it's not a harmful thing by any measure. It's more about how people adapt to the changes we're having.
And that's what I was saying. I mean, societies have always strived to make progress and become more advanced through, more sophisticated technology. So, but lately it is fair to argue that, things like AI and machine learning are substantial threats to human workers. So would you guys see regulation and taxation on these technologies protecting workers, or would it more rather just hinder, market-based activity and even just like progress as a nation?
Yeah, sure. So one thing just to clarify here, like when we talk about digitalization, it's not exactly the same thing as like AIs or, machine learning that we're all hearing about the buzzwords. Digitalization is more about, people using computers at their workplace. Right. So it's not replacing their job. It's just part of their task is now being, done by computer, but still it's human doing the computer jobs, right? Like it's that people need to learn the technology to how to use computer, how to use electronic devices, how to, just use spreadsheet or, Microsoft Word. That's the basic stuff.
Okay, so you identified like a trend in which the people in lower digitalization jobs, their digitalization score is increasing, as well as in the middle tier, whereas in the upper tier is decreasing a little bit. And you also said that it's important for the digitalization of all jobs, I think a few seconds ago. So I was wondering if whether as this trend continues, whether the three tiers that were mentioned would possibly become only one or two, or they would grow very close together.
Yeah, certainly one thing that we, is a finding throughout is convergence in the kinds or in the digital intensity of occupations is occurring. As you pointed out, the fastest upskilling is happening in kind of the lower and low, medium digital occupations. And that kind of surprising finding about some of the highest digital occupations actually becoming less digital, we think is largely driven by the fact that the kinds of tasks that are involved in those occupations are changing and involving, to the extent that they involve more managerial type work. It's maybe diluting in some ways the the way or the extent to which computers are occupying the bulk of your time, or the use of computers are occupying the bulk of your time. As to whether or not
I mean, this convergence in digital scores will necessarily mean that, you know, in the fullness of time, all occupations in the economy are going to require you to be on a computer all day.
Right.
I think that's very unlikely, and as we mentioned in the report, there are some occupations, very large occupations, that have been really resistant to this change because in their nature, they don't really lend themselves to digitization in the same way. And so we think about care work, work that involves a lot of interpersonal interaction. So far, we haven't really found a good way to substitute digital technologies for the human touch in those cases. And certainly with the aging of the workforce, we would expect those are going to be an increasing share of the jobs in the economy.
Yeah. Anything?
Yeah, that's good.
All right. Yeah. So, like you said, like this rapid digitalization of the labor is obviously making a lot of people develop their technological prowess. You know, developing their technological skills. But in your opinion, are people adapting to this change well? Is there evidence to show that, you know, we as just the general population are adapting to these changes? Or is it maybe driving people out of the industries which are requiring more technological expertise?
Sorry, I'm not sure if I understand your question correctly. So are you saying that, like, are people adapting to the changes?
Yeah, are they adapting to it well?
At
like,
the same, like, pace? Or is that
yeah,
what
no, I mean,
suggesting?
is the evidence showing that, like, you know, workers are adapting to these changes well, or it might just be moving too
Oh, to,
fast
like,
for them?
jumping
Yeah.
People that are already in
I
the
see.
jobs, are they able to
Right.
adapt, or is it pushing them out in favor
Right.
of
Okay,
newer
gotcha.
people that are
Right.
better capable of handling the new tech?
Sure. Yeah. So I think there's a like important aspect here, like we say like on-the-job training, right? Because people do not adapt to the changes themselves. They need like external resources to help them. It's so if you think about like a worker, he might never use a computer before. How is he supposed to adapt to it? He needs those training classes, or his employer needs to provide those on-job training to give him that kind of opportunity to, you know, adapt. So that's why in the report we also have like several proposals saying, you know, like how we should think about this on-ramping thing for the workers. It's more about employers and communities needs to provide the support they needed.
So in the paper, as you just mentioned, you mentioned a myriad of solutions such as instituting CS education in K through 12 grades, offering code boot camps, and incentivizing companies to prepare incumbent workers.
Yeah.
And you obviously for all of these things, funding is a very important issue, and you mentioned government and public-private partnerships as two sources. I was wondering whether there was one of these partial solutions that you would recommend as the primary or initial focus of the government that would be more beneficial in the short term than the other, and in the long term than the other.
Well, I mean, I think that at this point it's a little bit hard to say exactly what is going to be the real silver bullet here, to the extent that there even is one, which I think is why in the report we kind of took the approach of just highlighting some successful examples of both private and public initiatives which have gone some way in addressing this skills gap issue. And you know, the Microsoft Academy in North Carolina is a good example of a joint venture. Really, the key, I think, in assessing the efficacy of these programs is whether, or to what extent we can really learn from these programs is whether it's reasonable to think that they can scale. Because a lot of very successful local efforts maybe are too embedded in the particular context that they're operating in and wouldn't be very effective as a state or national policy. But just to piggyback on what Sifan was saying in response to the previous question as well, I might say that we think we're not actually doing a very good job of helping people manage this transition, and that in fact is driving a lot of the polarization of the labor market, that our educational pipeline is very much geared towards a 20th century economy and getting people trained to participate in those kinds of jobs, which are increasingly just not there, or don't provide people with the same standard of living that they once might have. And so all the kinds of responses that Sifan pointed out that we suggest are ways to kind of correct for that, and as a consequence, mitigate against this tendency towards inequality.
Okay, so you just stated there, and you also stated in your paper that the education might need to be reformed to introduce CS or various softwares into primary schools. Do you believe, in addition to not only introducing tech, this would help to curate a population that is more ready to adapt to the challenges in an evolving workplace?
So you mean like early exposure to tech and coding?
So not just being able to use different softwares, but also able to adapt to things that they learn, like helping them to have the ability to learn.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, we totally agree. Like, because as you said, like it's constantly evolving, right? And with like the machine learning stuff, we might anticipate like coding might also be, like a decreasing demand. So it's more important to, help the students or workers they're the same, right? Like to how to learn the new stuff, how to adapt to the new changes, like a constant learning, or what we might say like lifelong learning experience for every single person.
Right. So it's kind of earlier the better. Like the more exposure you're getting earlier on, it does make an impact, you would say.
Like we don't have like evidence, like solid evidence on that. It's more,
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, just as a general principle, I do think that it would be the case that familiarizing younger students with these kinds of technologies will just, you can think about it, I'm sure, in all of our own lives, the fact that we were born post-internet means that we never actually had to learn it. Like we just grew up with kind of basic familiarity with those technologies. And same thing goes for stuff that has yet to be invented yet.
Okay, so as you've mentioned the polarization that's taking place, do you believe that if this were to continue, do you believe that basic income could be something that would be instituted, or do you find that feasible, or?
And we've also read about experiments that have been conducted in Finland with smaller populations, like 2,000 or so, but and there's obviously been a growing support for it, and universal too, not just the unemployed, but everybody virtually in a country. So would that end up being a solution to kind of people who are affected by this in a negative way? Maybe people who aren't able to adapt as quickly in lower tier jobs, if they're given a basic income, can that be like the solve all problems type solution? Or
so my understanding of that Finland experiment that you read about, so the rationale between like providing a basic income to the some of the population is that they have that kind of like bandwidth to develop their own things. Because if you are living from and bills to bills, like you just don't have that capacity to maybe start my own business, do some creative work, learn new stuff, go to school. That's kind of the thing that the basic income trying to address, like to give people like the basic living standards so that you could spend time on the stuff that you want to focus on or you need to focus on. So I think that idea it's great for if people need to adapt to like the technology changes we were talking about, right? Like if you need to go to class, it's be hard if you're working full time during the day. So basic income could possibly give that kind of opportunity to them. So to that extent, I think it's it's a great way. But again, there'll be like a lot of others. It's not like in Finland you can do a pilot in a like very small population.
Right. That makes sense.
Yeah, but like in a larger scale, like like I think we still don't have that much evidence yet.
Right, that makes
Yeah,
sense.
and the other thing I would add is totally agree with Sifan to the extent that UBI is a way, functions similarly, I guess, to different kinds of social insurance programs, which kind of allow workers to transition more easily between work or to go into totally new fields which they don't necessarily have the skills for, but which, you know, this would allow them to pursue that kind of training. Yeah, it definitely seems to address a lot of the issues we identify in the report.
Right.
But at the same time, there is a line of argument about UBI that it is a response to the kind of net destruction of jobs which is going to occur as a result of AI or machine, you know, these
Yeah.
new emerging disruptive technologies. And I still think it's, I don't want to speak for Sifan, but the jury is certainly still out that we've entered into some era where there's just going to be less employment,
Right.
less jobs for people to do. Certainly the nature of work is going to be totally different. But I hardly think that we're on very solid ground if we think that there are just going to be fewer jobs for people to be doing in the next 15 to 20 years, and therefore there are some people that are just going to have to receive some sort of transfer to support themselves. And so getting these labor market and training policies right is
awesome.
would necessarily be an important addition to any sort of like cash
Yeah.
transfer program like
Right.
this.
So I think towards the end of the paper, you mentioned that social skills, and I think you also just mentioned there, are due to become very important as machine learning possibly takes some of the jobs that people previously would have done in, I don't know, coding. Do you believe that the government should still maybe enact educational reform, even though they could enact it and then the people would learn how to use softwares and other things like that, just for it to become not obsolete but less important as social skills take the foremost place in advantageous traits?
Yeah, I mean, it's you know, we were just speaking about this. It's kind of, we think, like the nature of technological change, that you're always going to have to be kind of trying to react to changes that are taking place in the economy driven by technology or different market forces. And so, you know, I guess the lesson then isn't necessarily to try and outthink or always be anticipating, but to have programs, institutions that are flexible enough, and then also workers and students who are flexible enough to be able to quickly adapt to those changes. And yeah, I mean, it's hardly a zero-sum thing, learning coding, but also learning how to be a good team player, or you know, having good emotional intelligence. You know, I think those are things we could all benefit from.
Yeah. Also, just like coding, right? It's not like a destination. It's more about like a pathway that you need to, like, get your foot in the door. About just we talking about, like, you know, right now the coder's jobs might involve a lot of manager like task, but that requires you have like basic coding skill in a lot of places, right? So it's not about like, oh, I learned coding and then it will be replaced again and what I'm gonna do. It's not that case, right? It's just like it's something that you cannot really bypass. It's something you have to like step in.
Right. Do you have anything to add to that, or?
No, I thought that was very interesting, as I was sort of wondering, so you think that would be helpful in developing workers that are better suited to the new workforce? I was wondering if you had any other suggestions on fostering a working class that is better able to adapt or think creatively
Would there be any like new traits, for example? I mean, there obviously are some traits, like you said, social skills, being a team player, that applies to almost every career, and it's applied to almost every career for many years. But are we seeing any new types of skills that people should be trying to develop outside of their job, like in order to actually come in and be ready to perform well.
Technical skills or more of these soft skills?
Soft skills, I guess. Are there any just soft skills being required nowadays, or is it generally the same, would you say?
I mean, I think you kind of said it, that there really are things that working in particular kinds of environments will always require.
Yeah.
Working with other people will necessitate you knowing how to both be in leadership positions and also to effectively take instruction or direction.
Right.
I think as well as these more kind of personal care type jobs become a larger share of employment in the economy. Being comfortable and familiar, interacting with people who are different than you. I mean, these are things that are not like taught in a classroom,
Exactly.
but which are, certainly socialized in a classroom environment.
Yeah.
And so,
So not to put words in your mouth, but I mean, would your message to kids who are in high school, kids who are in college, just be if you develop your technical skills well enough and you're, developing also these soft skills which have been around for a lot of years, then you shouldn't stress too much about, not being in the workforce or being unemployed. Or maybe there are just other outside factors which they should be aware of. I don't.
You mean like what would we say to someone who doesn't have a job, or
someone who's in high school and college? Because I mean, obviously,
I see.
I mean, a lot of kids I know, like, especially even in high school, like
Right.
we know a lot of kids who are always studying not for the sake of learning, but because they're worried about
Right.
Missing out in the workforce, especially in a workforce nowadays. So if you're developing your technical skills, is there really anything to worry about, or just doing the right thing, kind of? I don't.
Like, I'm not sure we're in a position to comment though, but like it's more about like personally I would say yes.
Okay, yes.
And at least for the short term, like
Yeah.
because you see that's where the demands are. Like all the job openings, well, most of the job openings are happen in tech industries, and you see definitely like a significant job growth and also wage growth as well.
Right.
Okay, so sort of switching to a different topic a little bit, we found the parallel that you drew between people that are able to compete in the workforce and also cities that are able to compete in terms of digitalization. Very interesting. So we were wondering whether you had any suggestions on how to halt this divide, if it should be halted, or what the long-term effect of this might be.
Yeah, so certainly these kinds of labor supply responses that we're talking about apply as much at the level of individual cities as they do at the national level, which is to say that if your region's workforce has deficits in its capacity to utilize new digital technologies, then it's going to have a chilling effect on investment in new industries, certainly. But then the other thing is I mean, you can't ignore all of the other sorts of demand side factors that contribute to even having a region which is conducive to incubating these sorts of businesses. And so that's committing to local research institutions, especially universities that might exist there in these places, and then I mean, high quality infrastructure, particularly broadband would be something that places can compete on.
All right. Awesome. All right.
Do you have anything to, or we good there? Okay.
I think it's all the questions we have.
Yeah. So.
Do you guys have anything else to say just to end it, or?
I don't know.
All right.
I think that's it then.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your time.
All right, thank you so much.
Really
Yeah,
appreciate
absolutely.
It.
Awesome.
Definitely keep us in the loop.
Yeah.
Right?
Thank you so much.
You,
All right.
You go public with this.
All right. Thank you for joining us for another episode, and we'll see you on the next one.